I think Gurdjieff clearly understood that if we are going to have a new concept of God, that new concept had to include how do things happen? How does the world govern itself? How do all of these things carry on? Very, very straightforward questions. There's a totally different concept that Gurdjieff is intent on bringing forth. It is a concept that is, from some perspectives, totally at odds with all prior concepts, and yet at the same time, it is a magnificent reconciliation of exactly those things that come and were emphasized in the great traditions, that were pointing always, always to the reality of our inner world, and to the necessity of us coming more and more to live in that inner world, or from that inner world. What Gurdjieff referred to as the world of the true consciousness, a world of relationship, and a world of being open to all living things and in appropriate relationship to them. Very much a Buddhist thought. So, but he had to incorporate that and take the how things happen into consideration with how we should be. And I think that this is one of the great paradoxes that we see recurring throughout history. The difference between a teaching that tells you how you should be, how you should behave, and how you should believe, and how things happen. So Gurdjieff confronts this in a very kind of semi-humorous but very serious fashion when he talks about the old Jew with a comb in his pocket as being the anthropomorphized vision of God that many of the great traditions carrying into the present time have of God. That God for these people is like an old Jew with a comb in his pocket. And in other words, this very limited, restrictive, anthropomorphized vision of a great being who is directing the order of things on the universe, with no concern within that conception of how things happen. And Gurdjieff was clearly aware. He was very widely read in all of the scientific literature of the late 19th, early 20th century, and the writings on the wall. You know, if there is going to be a reconciliation and a reintroduction of truly spiritual themes into the life of man, so that transformation becomes a real possibility, etc., then you have to take all of this into account. You cannot not do that. Now, when you go back and it's interesting, in the early 31 manuscript of Beelzebub's Tales, the word God appears very frequently. In the 1950 edition, not exclusively, but with a surprising preponderance, he's changed many of those expressions to endlessness. And I choose to think that this is a very significant insight on his part, that if you're going to talk about God, then you got to do everything you can to move away from the automatic reflection inside of people about what God is. Because as soon as you say that, then all of their upbringing, all of their, what he called itoklenos, their traditional, from their family, from their religious exposure, etc., they all come up with this concept of this notion of God. And if anything, he very gently wanted to dismember that, and create a new concept. And that new concept, it really is heralded, in a sense, by his use of the term endlessness. That his endlessness is endless. It's not singularity. It's not defined. It's not anthropomorphized. It's simply endless. In the great traditions, one of the unfortunate things that comes through in the minds of many people is that there is some kind of perfect order. There's some kind of perfection that we all can be aligned to and that we should follow, etc. And Gurdjieff is giving us, I think, opening a door, because you can't forcibly do this kind of thing. You have to make it possible for people to begin to see that it's not like that. that it really is an endlessly creative circumstance. So there are no set of laws that say immutably, this is what shall be. No, there is always what Gurdjieff called the law of hazard, or the law of seven. There are always gaps. There are always interrelationships that are absolutely unpredictable even for endlessness. Okay, so that things can happen that are big surprises or unexpected, unanticipated kind of results. They are all lawful, you see, and this is a paradox that many people, I think, many people in their religious dispositions have a really hard time with. That there can be a lawfulness that allows for tragic mistakes, for accidents to happen. Almost all the great traditions, not so much the Eastern, the Buddhist and Hindu, but certainly the Western traditions, there is a directiveness to the laws set down by endlessness. For instance, God can enter into the universe now, today, and produce miracles or produce great suffering on the part of people who don't do what he tells them to do, and so on and so on. We've got lots and lots of history of that kind of thing. How much of that's fantasy and how much is myth, that's not my point. My point is that we still believe in it. Many, many people still believe that God can intervene, that there can be, and one of the most startlingly and repetitious points that Gurdjieff tries to get across is that the world is not made like that. Again, Gurdjieff has angels and archangels, all through the tales, who are part of the creative unfolding of the universe. But again, lawfully, these entities or powers or laws, however you see that embodiment of them in angels or archangels or whatever, they are limited powers. They make big mistakes. And he's got in his myth, he's got a number of things where he, for instance, he calls one of the most serious impositions the implantation of Kundabuffer into early man, really early life. He calls this later in the tales a nearly unforgivable sin. But this was imposed by supposedly the High Commission. So we see this introduction again on Gurdjieff's part, that higher powers there are, but they are not aware of everything. They are not omniscient. That things can happen within the law at that level that will very, very seriously create difficulties in another world, and that there is no way out of it. There's no way to prevent that kind of thing from happening. Why? Because that's the law. And God, even endlessness, cannot intervene. That if things are going to hell in a hand bucket, which they most certainly seem to be around us today, then we're responsible for that. There's no way out. We cannot pray our way out of that or beseech the Lord to intervene and change the laws. The laws are the laws. And Gurdjieff is so insistent on just pounding at that point that the source of evil in this world, and this is another major differentiation of Gurdjieff about endlessness and about a new concept of God. There is no separate evil that exists out there somewhere in the universe and that invades the space of man and so forth. Man is the source of evil. That we are, through our egoism and our selfishness and so on and so on, it is not that we have a devil speaking in our ear. It is that we fall and are trapped and identified with our own puffed up sense of ourselves and of how we want everything to be our way. So we become greedy and suspicious and violent towards each other and so forth. And we are the source of that. Gurdjieff spent immense energy in the tales and in his other writing and in his teaching in a daily life sense, trying to get this point across over and over and over. The source of evil in this world is you and me. We are the source. There is no such other entity out there. And in fact, he claims this is one of the great mistakes of the Babylonian civilization, that they introduced what he called this system of this duality, that there can be good and evil, and they are separate, distinct things. And he says, no, it's not like that at all. So this is a big part of the new concept of God as well, certainly. The three sacred impulses, those that I mentioned, faith, hope, and love, in the way in which I talked about them, Gurdjieff then comes along in the tales, and he talks about how, especially with the coming of Ashiata Shamash, one of the great messengers, and he goes through great sufferings, and he sits for 60 days or 90 days, and he sits and pulls a hair off his chest every day, okay. So Ashiata finally looks around and he says, my mission is to try to help man free himself from Kundabuffer, from all of the lack of consciousness and so on and so on. So he looks at the prior manifestations of the great messengers. Some have come and they put their central teaching in some form of faith, others in some form of hope, and others in some form of love. And he comes to the conclusion, after a very careful evaluation of all of these, that they didn't work. So he has to take up a different path. And his path is conscience. So conscience, yes, conscience. So the core of Ashiata's teaching is the development in normal three brain beings of the impulse of conscience. Because faith, hope, and love are divine impulses, they are present throughout the universe. They are present in planets, in suns, in everything. And therefore, they're vulnerable, because they're out there. Conscience, however, is, as he says, is deeply, deeply buried in our emotional world. And it escapes. You see, faith, hope, and love could be corrupted. And they were corrupted. The message of the great messengers was turned upside down within 3 generations. It all became muck. Okay. So, but conscience was preserved almost in its pristine, infantile form. Okay. And so the teaching of Ashiata is bent on gradually unfolding the reality of conscience and then bringing it to the forefront more and more and more. So many people, many authors have claimed that this is really the core of Gurdjieff's teaching. It's certainly a core of the Gurdjieff teaching, is that what he is really, really aiming for to try and unfold in people is a recognition that conscience does exist, that it's very deeply hidden, and that it's going to involve a lot of suffering to get there. And fine, if you want to make that the core, then, to me, Gurdjieff is even bigger than that, okay, even bigger. Because while he has a conscience, Beelzebub has conscience, he is, after all, a higher being who's taken directly onto Holy Son Absolute in service to endlessness. So he can't be a person with an ordinary physical body like you or I. He has to have a higher body already perfected to qualify for going on Holy Son Absolute. And he certainly has conscience, since everybody with a higher being body has conscience. So he goes on there, and he looks around, and he's disturbed by what he sees. He thinks that he sees something illogical in the way in which the world is working out.
No doubt.
And he not only complains about it, but he sets about to get other people, other angelic or whatever higher being creatures to agree with him. He really, really goes at it. Why? Because the force of his will. His will is an independent will. It's his own. And he must follow it. And he is, as Gurdjieff elaborates, he is young, okay? He's inexperienced, but he's brilliant. So he sees this that he thinks is illogical, and he goes and creates a big mess and brings the central kingdom to a near revolution. Well, when Endlessness hears about this, he looks at the whole situation and he says, Beelzebub, you are banned. You are banished. Well, most people look at that and their first reading is that that's a punishment. You know, it's not. It's not at all a punishment. It's the only thing that Beelzebub lacks. He lacks reason, higher reason. How is he going to get that? He has to go all the way to the bottom. He has to be sent down where all this shit happens and see how it must work out the way in which the laws have said they must work out. So he's there on Mars, on what I consider to be a higher emotional center. And then from there, he observes things going on Earth, and because he becomes very perplexed by some of them, and then involved because of the stupid actions of one of his countrymen, who makes the same damn mistake that Beelzebub made back on Holy Son Absolute. The young kinsman goes to Earth and thinks that he's figured things out. He knows what's going wrong, and he tries and convinces the king to install a new policy, which gets the kinsman in trouble, and then all of the other kinsmen who are on Earth have to pay up to pay the debts that the young kinsmen have, and that isn't enough, and then the call goes all the way back to Mars. So finally, Beelzebub says, you know, I got to go down to Earth and figure out what the hell this young man has gotten himself into. So that's the first of the descents, and then it goes through the rest of the descent. Marvelous, interesting story of how Beelzebub's reason is tested. And so you can build an argument. The six descents are marvelously complex, and you can't say that they are just this at all. But among other things, the six descents are really a demonstration of the increasing reason of Beelzebub. In other words, what he comes to finally understand. The first time, it's a very practical, straightforward thing, that you can't mess with this world the way it is. You got to accept it on its terms. So when you go down to World 48, you got to accept it in our daily life. You know, there isn't any magical solution. We got to treat it. We got to accept it as it is. I'm responsible as an adult. I'm a human being with a physical body. I'm a male, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I got to own up to those responsibilities. Got to pay my taxes on that. So if I try and get out of it, then there's going to be suffering, you know. But it's the higher parts of me that do the suffering. The lower parts are simply the lower parts. They'll complain, but it's the higher part that suffers. The kinsman who came down from Mars to the Earth and meddled and muddled things up. Yeah, Kundabuffer, in Gurdjieff's great conception of that singularity that he takes as multiple in search, and here in the Tales he treats as a singularity. What he is singularizing around is the lack of consciousness. And that's at every level inside of us, in our three-brainedness. All that we construct, all that we invent, all of the circumstances of life that we come up against, that we then create an I to deal with, and so forth and so on. All of that is so constructed that there is no consciousness of each other of those parts that's going on. So inevitably there is concealment. The concealment is not intentional. That would imply a kind of consciousness that I am consciously going to conceal it. No, it's the law. And we are, unfortunately, we are bound to be that way as long as we are in that state of consciousness. Causes of war, yeah. He approaches that, and I wrote a couple of chapters on trying to get a little closer to what his vision, what he saw. Yeah. Well, one of the first things that Gurdjieff demolishes as causes of war are singular individuals. In other words, he said, wars are not caused by Hitler or Idi Amin or Stalin or whatever. This is nonsense. They are figureheads. They are put forward by all of the propaganda itself, props up these false images. The causes of war lie in us, in our inner world, exactly like Krishnamurti would say, that when these are unresolved conflicts inside of ourselves, we resolve them by putting them outside, and then it's you son of a bitch, get out of my way, and on and on and on. And inevitably, then I pick up my gun, and then we glorify that. We think that, we stand for freedom in the world, and on and on and on. So the nonsense, the Kundabafarian nonsense, has no limit placed on it. It can go on forever. It can become cosmic. And we have, unfortunately, some fundamentalist perspectives that want to make it cosmic, so the causes ultimately, and here's where Gurdjieff's differentiation of good and evil becomes more and more and more essential to see how he really is trying to get this across, that evil is in us, and its ultimate source is egoism. So the very thing that makes life in its first brain activity, if you will, and even before that in microcosmos and tetracosmos, this impulse of living, staying alive. As I have this little paper of Mrs. Popoff that she shared with us called "A Real Man Wishes to Live Forever." Well, I puzzle over that and puzzle over that because I know I'm not going to live forever. But yet there is this statement, a real man wishes to live forever. Well, one can see this in so many ways. The return to God, the return through higher being body, through higher reason and so forth. All of this that shows so well on the lateral octave, that one can create a new Kesjan and create a higher being body, and then return to Holy Son Absolute. That's the end, prospective end of that progression. So, what stands in the way? The very thing that also makes us distinctive. In other words, the wish to live. Even though it is individualized in living forms, it is enormously powerful, the most powerful thing that there is. And this, I believe, is Gurdjieff's core principle, is that all of this nonsense about good and evil in the world, that they are somehow or other separate powers from the laws, that this is a very destructive thing. He said this is the Babylonian dual entry into the life of man that was unbelievably destructive, because it opens the door to this consideration of evil being something that has an existence separate from man, that's out there in devils and evil things and all of this kind of thing. Gurdjieff insisted that it is man's egoism, that when he turns on himself and becomes God in his inner world and refuses to be of service, then he becomes a monster. And this is the ultimate cause of war. That all of us, either by passive agreement with the rightness of our cause and so on, if I am so propagandized in my inner world that I think that the worst thing that could possibly happen to Europe was the invasion by Hitler, and therefore we have to do something about this, then I could dedicate myself and my confreres and so on to taking up rifles and going over there and fighting. So, but that's the duped, okay? That's the propagandized. The people who are at the upper echelon of all of that, all the way from people like Hitler and the Nazi movement, but also including Standard Oil and all of the things in the United States that supported that and fed that and made billions of bucks off of it. they are just as responsible ultimately. So the egoism is a very individuated thing, which at the same time can become a terrible monster when it becomes united in its egoism, that we are right. We must stand against all of this and so on and so on. And we have the right answer and nobody else does. And if you don't believe us, we'll simply do away with you. Well, that's how I understand Gurdjieff saw, and why he saw, when Hussein finally asks him, what can be done, grandfather? What can be done? And he says, I don't know. I mean, it's a delightful end of the chapter because he kind of drops you off the edge of this cliff. I don't know. There have been many efforts made, and throughout the whole chapter he takes up efforts that have been made in ancient China and in the Far East and in the Middle West. Throughout time, he said, this has happened many times. The United Nations has been recreated many, many times. The effort of good men who are then infected by these monsters, and then they turn it all upside down and it comes to nothing. So Gurdjieff feels that at the very, very end of the tales, Hussein supposedly asks him this question. He has just been recognized as one of the great Potgulats. He was a Potgulat from early on, but he finally grew his horns in this special ceremony. So now what was there all the time becomes externally manifested. So as a sacred Potgulat, he is on his way back home to Caritas, his birth planet, the planet of all truly independent wills. Okay. So he's on his way home, and then suddenly he is asked this question. Hussein asks him this question. What can be done? What can be done about the circumstance of man on the earth, and with all of this that you have taught me about? And suddenly, and this is where the storyline I think is so obvious, suddenly Beelzebub stands up, and one arm is thrust up and the other down, and a glow begins. So he's standing in the presence of endlessness. So Hussein, the grandson's question, becomes endlessness's question. What can be done? Because what comes back from up above, you, Beelzebub, from your long experience, so forth and so on, tell us what is the answer to this? So we're put in this very interesting philosophical, psychological, and spiritual mode of question. Here is endlessness asking Beelzebub a question. Well, this is not an exam. This is not whether he graduates from high school or not. It's not that he gets a pat on the head. Endlessness does not know. And that's so plain on the surface of what Gurdjieff is trying to get across. This is endlessness question. This is part of the hazard of existence. The hazard is you can have all the laws, but in the law of seven in particular, this is the law of hazard. Things will happen that even endlessness can't anticipate, cannot see, will happen. So he wants to know too, obviously. So he asks Beelzebub, what can be done? And what is Beelzebub's answer? You have to instill another organ, like Kunterbuffer. But now it has to have a characteristic of reminding one right in the moment that everyone on whose eyes you touch is going to die, and you're going to die. And only then can the process begin to root out egoism. So he sticks with it right to the very, very end. It is egoism which is the root of all that has been standing in man's way. And yet, egoism is the gift of potentially a reunited will. So it's a very interesting, paradoxical, powerful, I think very powerful notion, because it's given then to each of us that we have this spark. We have this given spark of wishing to live. And what do we do with it? How do we mature it? How do we grow it? How do we turn it into something that can be a useful servant? You know, and that's a big part of Kirch's message. You know, and he believes that what is absolutely essential is that we use all of the understandings that have come from our understanding of the physical world, all the scientific understandings. We must buckle down and accept modern biology and see that biology is biology, biology by damn. And you cannot work your way around that. You cannot think your way or wish your way or pray your way around it. It is what it is. So that makes it so realistic for me, you know, that since he poses the science of the West and the wisdom of the East and the blending of those two, this is a great requirement for reconciliation. And it's the only answer at the very end of the tales. There's no other way out of this mess, you know.